Well, for lack of a more creative title, I'll title this sermon Lessons from Harvey, or maybe Observations from Harvey, and maybe begin with a thought. Obviously, I can't cover all the lessons or thoughts or observations. I'm sure every one of us have our own individual ones, but maybe begin with one that's a little reflection more on the community in general. I think we're all uplifted as a community, as a citizenship or citizenry, here in Houston or wherever anybody might live, but uplifted when we see people coming to the aid of those facing calamity. And there's remarkable stories, not only here, but wherever there's been any kind of disaster, where people have had an outstanding example of sacrifice. And there was one story in the paper, I think it was today's paper, about one poor lady, maybe you read it, she was trapped, or at least the water was very high in their house, and she went into labor. And the people that had to respond to her and get her to the hospital and the ordeal, and all right in the midst of the worst part of the storm. Well, I'll read something from ABC News. There are many remarkable rescue stories and acts of kindness coming out of Texas in the Hurricane Harvey's wake, with hometown heroes braving the flood waters in everything from boats to big rigs to jet skis. People are banding together to help where they can. Their powerful visuals of these heartwarming moments have lifted people up in these times of peril and will continue to do so as the entire state moves towards recovery. There's too many stories to really relate. Nick Sheraton drove nearly 200 miles with his big rig to help rescue those stranded in the floodwaters. Many people came from out of town. With the help of two other truck drivers, the three of them rescued more than 1,000 people. Jim Mattress Mac, Mackingvale, owner of Gallery Furniture, has opened several locations across Houston to help shelter those that are displaced. I didn't know anything about Mattress Mac, but some of you may have a mattress from Gallery Furniture. Well, what about people? It maybe poses a good question we can spend just a few minutes on. What about human beings and man's nature, as we call it, sometimes referred to it as human nature, which is not necessarily bad of and by itself. It's a fascinating subject and very, very puzzling. Human behavior. What's our perspective on it? Sometimes we've thought in the past, well, nobody could ever do anything good unless they're in the church or unless they have God's Spirit. That's not really the case. I think we understand that. We all acknowledge that there are really some, depending how you use the term good, just some good people in the world. We've seen tremendous examples of that this past week with good qualities. Romans chapter 5 and verse 7, Romans 5:7. And it was mentioned, the Governor Abbott calling for a day of prayer tomorrow. It'll be good for all of us just simply to remember that, make mention of that. And we all know the condition the world is. We know that it's blinded. I'll mention some things in a moment. But God also tends to respond when leaders of a nation, not church members, just leaders, turn people to God or to something righteous, something moral, something that is away from a wrong spirit. God has a way of appreciating that and responding to that. So it can't help but help. If it's taken to heart, here's a governor making this proclamation, calling upon people to look to God, as he mentioned there. So as Mr. Frank said, that was a very positive thing to do, and you don't hear as much about that today in our country as maybe you've heard in the past. Well, Romans 5 and verse 7 says, "For scarcely for a righteous man will one person give his life, yet I suppose for a good man some would even dare to." Well, there are some good men, good women. The Bible recognizes that. Jesus gave that example, or the Apostle Paul did. Well, sometimes when we got a good person, they've been a decent person. There are those that are in our world and around us, in our neighborhood. Romans chapter 2 mentions this as well. For when the Gentiles, it means those that are not Jews, not converted, or even Jews, which don't have the law. God didn't present the law down from Mount Sinai for the Gentiles, but they do by nature the things that you find in the law. Don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't kill, etc. When they do that, because they believe in that, obviously, having not a law or a law unto themselves. So the people do that. Morally minded. I'd like to read in Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, verse 30. This will only take us a few moments, but I'll refer to it. Here's the parable of the Good Samaritan. Let's think about this one for a moment. In Luke chapter 10, verse 30, Jesus said unto them, there happened to be a man that went down from Jerusalem on his way to Jericho, and he fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. So some people are thieves. Now, why are they that way? Why do we have people like that? Well, that's not an easy thing to answer always. And a lot of sociologists and criminologists, they try to examine motivation. I'll mention one important factor here in a moment. But here's somebody that was on his way to Jericho, and they robbed him, took his money. Now, just by chance, there came down a certain priest the same way. When he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Same thing with a Levi. You got the priest and the Levites, religious people, Jews. Likewise, the Levi, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. Then came a certain Samaritan. The Jews thought there's nothing good about a Samaritan. They're imposters, claiming that they have the law from God, and they worship God on Mount Gerizim instead of Mount in Jerusalem, Mount Moriah. So now the Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where this man was laying there, apparently, and when he saw him, he just was moved with compassion. A Samaritan, but a decent person, obviously. Different than the thieves, for sure. So he went to him, and he bound up his wounds, pouring oil on him and wine, and set him on his own beast, brought him unto the inn so that they would take care of him, and he could mend. The next day when he departed, he took out 2 pence and gave it to the host and said unto him, take care of the man, get him back on his feet. And if it costs you more than that, takes longer than we anticipate, I'll make it right when I come back. Jesus said, now who do you suppose is the neighbor? Well, of course, they were able to answer that very easily. Verse 37, he said, he that showed mercy on him. And then Jesus said, well, you do the same thing. You have that mindset, that motivation. It's a wonderful parable, a wonderful story. Of course, people all over the world know the story of the Good Samaritan and the lesson. And it's helped people down through history be more morally minded, at least with that story in mind. A special lesson for the Jews who thought they were so much better than somebody else. So here's a story. The priest passed by, the Levite passes, and a Samaritan helps him. A caring person in the world. Wasn't somebody in the church or wasn't a Jew. A caring, decent person. Now we'll learn on the Day of Atonement what the fundamental cause of problems in our society are. Look at Genesis chapter 3, just for a moment. Genesis chapter 3. Just a way of understanding a little bit about our world, and the holy days, of course, illuminate some of this as well. In Genesis chapter 3, the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord had made. He says unto the woman, yes, as God said, you shall eat of every tree of the garden. The woman said unto the serpent, well, just having a conversation, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it. It didn't bother her. Obviously, God made us. He said, don't eat that tree. We're fine with that. We're okay. We had a lot of other trees. In other words, they were very neutral. They weren't created with animosity built in against God. They were more or less neutral. They weren't spiritually minded terribly, and they weren't necessarily carnally minded and have an enmity against God. They were just Adam and Eve, 2 people. Well, of course, along came the influence, the subtlety, the persuasion. And you know the story, what happened, and who's responsible for it. Now, Adam and Eve had to make choices, but who was the tempter? Who was the one creating some of the problem? We know that's the issue, of course, that the world is dealing with. Adam and Eve was fine until they had their own exaggerated selfishness, what they wanted above what God wanted. They were listening to that influence. And that's basically what's out there in the world affecting so many. Adam and Eve listened to the devil and their self-concern, which is all right. Adam and Eve had to have concern for themselves or they wouldn't bother eating or protecting themselves. There's nothing wrong with loving yourself in the sense of what God has created. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. So we don't hate ourselves. We don't have to do that. But it turned to selfishness and me first. That was a problem, and that's what the devil helped them think about. So Satan's the one that tempts and influences the world, and we become carnally minded the more we listen to that. So we find people sacrificing, wanting to help. Story about Officer Perez, lost his life trying to get to help people, a police officer, and apparently ran into a flash flood, couldn't get out of his vehicle. Good intentions, I've got a duty, I want to help. We'd say a good person, wouldn't we, generally? And then others are looting, home repair scams, all kinds of deception of one type or another. Now, why some people allow themselves to think along those lines and become that selfishness, we know that Satan's a part of that. And why some in a certain way and why not others, and I don't think anybody has that answer exactly. We have a big piece of the puzzle. They don't fully understand everything involved in human motivation. Why are there some a certain way and others seem to be other? That's the nature of the world. What are we going to be? What kind of people will our children be? What do we believe in? What spirit works in our lives? That, of course, is an important question for us. There is a Satan's wavelength. So we see both good and evil in the world. Look at Ezekiel chapter 36, one or two more verses here on this first thought. Ezekiel 36:26. Some people yield to impulses of evil more readily than others. Some are tempted in some way, in a way that others are not. Sometimes individuals learn hard lessons, don't they? Well, we all do at one time or another. Ezekiel 36:26, during the millennium it says, a new heart also will I give you, a new spirit I'll put within you. I'll take away the stony heart out of your flesh, give you a heart of flesh. Well, why would anybody need God's Spirit? If Satan's removed and he's not around, his influence is not during the millennium, then people are not going to be tempted to do evil. So why do they need another spirit? Well, because mankind, whether Satan's gone or not, we're not naturally spiritually minded. We don't necessarily have spiritual mindedness. Again, we're kind of neutral. Satan will be gone, and that's good, but we're not automatically just spiritual. We need a spirit to help us. John chapter 13, verse 34. We don't need just human love. We need something that comes from God's Spirit. Jesus said, a new commandment I give to you, my disciples, that you love one another as I've loved you, and that wasn't an ordinary love. And I'm sure many thousands of examples of helping. You wonder a little bit, I wonder how many would help in the same way if it was an enemy. You know, that of course is what Christians are called upon to do at times. Have the same kind of love that Christ had for us, as it says in Romans 5:8. He commends his love towards us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So we, as God's people, celebrate. All those who do good, who show love, sacrifice. We appreciate that. We applaud that. We understand that's a part of the world in which we live in. We like to be around people like that. We should be around what we say good people, wholesome people, people that talk the right way, do the right things. Very important for our young people as well. So we celebrate that. We're called to live by a different spirit than the world has access to. That's true. Our righteousness, Jesus said, better transcend these Pharisees and Sadducees. We're not trying to outdo anybody. We don't have to try to do that. Outdo others. That's not the motivation. Christians are the ones that have the help of God's Spirit, and we're to allow that Spirit to work in our lives in a way that we would not be able to if we were not called and given God's Spirit. One final verse, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 8. Paul writing to the church, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 8, as we celebrate so many wonderful heartwarming stories that we've seen here the past several days, and we'll continue to see, I'm sure. 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 8. He therefore that despises not man but God, who has also given unto us his Holy Spirit. God hasn't given his Holy Spirit to everybody walking down the street. Even a lot of the good people don't have God's Spirit. So we have, to whom much is given, much is expected. So we have to allow that Spirit to work in our lives, not to outdo and compare, but simply allow that Spirit to motivate us as God intends for it to do. Now, another point in the way of lessons or observations, these experiences, some of these tragedies and difficulties, provide an opportunity to express compassion and concern. It provides an opportunity for those who may not be as affected to express compassion, concern, love, and to experience what that's like. It provides that opportunity. John McGinnis, a professional fisherman, drove 18 hours to Houston with his bass boat. Well, he wasn't going fishing. Drove 18 hours to Houston with his bass boat and has been taking people to safety. He told, listen to this, he told reporter Caitlin McCulley that he decided to head for Houston after watching footage of the devastation on TV. How many others came to town? Quite a few. So here's a quote from him. He said, we just come from a time in Kentucky when people used to love people and use things. Back in my day, we loved people and used things, he says, and it seems like the world's graduated to using people and love things. Yeah, interesting observation. Not everybody, maybe trending that way more and more. It was his observation, wasn't mine. But he came all that way, 18 hours. He just felt like, if you read the story, just felt the urge to try to help. Sounds like a decent person. So brotherly love, sympathy are qualities of God. And these circumstances provide an opportunity for us to express that should the opportunity arise. Learn the joy of serving. Look at Isaiah 58, verse 7. Isaiah 58, 7. Actually, perhaps referring more to the Day of Atonement and the fast that God calls upon us to experience. Isaiah 58, and the people were basically saying, what good's all this fasting doing anyway? It's not helping us a bit. When we go without food, where's our blessings? That was their attitude. So God, basically, you can read more of it. We'll just read verses 7 and 8. So he said, why am I calling upon? What's the purpose of this fast? Is it to go hungry? Impress somebody? Verse 7, isn't it to share your bread with the hungry? Isn't that to help you be motivated that way? The kind of person that would do that rather than be selfish? Isn't it so you'd share your bread with the hungry? To bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him with clothing? and not to raise yourself up from your own flesh and blood. I think this is the ISV translation. Quote, then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will spring up quickly. Your vindication will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will guard your back. Yeah, then things will happen when the fast is for the right reason, the right motivation. What would that be? What a help to give, to share, to do those things. Some are more naturally prone to doing that than others. I mean, we're all different. And we have those in the congregation here that seem to be just outstanding examples of helping and serving and thinking of others and compassion and reaching out. There are really some excellent examples. Look at Romans 12 and verse 6. Some are just naturally more prone to that. I don't have the answer for that either, other than we all have a gift. We're all good at something. These opportunities that happen where there's a need, provide those opportunities. Romans 12 and verse 6. We have different gifts based on the grace that was given to us. I guess born with it in some respects. So if your gift is prophecy, maybe I've met people in the church seem to have a keen interest and seem to be able to kind of put a perspective on prophetic things. I think Mr. Armstrong had that, a gift for prophecy. So if your gift is prophecy, well, use the gift in proportion to your faith. Don't do more than you're given. Stay within yourself. Stay with it, like I tell athletes, stay within your game. Don't try to be the hero. It won't work. Let it come. So if your gift is prophecy, use your gift in proportion to your faith. If your gift is serving, some are very serving. We have a service organization like hospice. Really have some very fine people that care and have a knack for that and have a gift for it. And all kinds of serving. So if your gift is serving, devote yourself to that opportunity. If it's teaching, I know people are good teachers, devote yourself to teaching others. If it is encouraging, this again I think is the ISV. If your gift is encouraging, then devote yourself to encouraging people. What a nice gift. If it's sharing, share generously. If it's leading, lead enthusiastically. Have leaders. People have a knack for leadership. Others tend to follow them. Then do it enthusiastically. If it's helping, help. So all these gifts. So this does provide that opportunity for people to do that. Doesn't mean what happens is good of and by itself. But it's an opportunity to use those gifts. It's a blessing for those that use their gifts. God tells us not to bury our gift. We shouldn't bury them. We don't compare ourselves, thinking my gift is better than your gift. Some of us are good at some things and not others. We don't compare that way. Evaluate who's got the better. The Corinthians were doing that. Paul had to remind them about that. Look at Isaiah chapter 30. This might be an interesting thought. God will want people in the millennium to experience all of this kind of serving, giving, compassion. Now, wait a minute. How could you have compassion for somebody in the millennium when everything's always going to go perfectly well for everybody and no one will need any compassion? Well, it's not going to be that way. What kind of world would that be? Wouldn't be realistic. Isaiah chapter 30. For the people shall dwell, I should give you the verse. Isaiah chapter 30, verse 19 and 20. The people will dwell in Zion and Jerusalem, the millennium. You're not going to weep anymore. He'll be very gracious unto you at the voice of your cry. Cry? Why would anybody be crying? When he shall hear it, he'll answer you. When you're in some distress, you're crying out, you have some need. He says, I'll hear you at that time. And though the Lord give you the bread of adversity, though the Lord gives some kind or allows some kind of adversity and some kind of affliction perhaps, life is life. It'll be a real world in the millennium. not a fairy tale. Be real people, real decisions, mistakes. Yet shall not your church teachers be removed into a corner anymore, your eyes shall see them, and so on. Well, it just mentions all of these things. Well, God will want people in the millennium to learn that too. Same kind of help, compassion, serving. Same gifts that we read about. How else would they learn them? One or two more verses, Acts chapter 20, verse 35. Acts 20, 35. I've shown you all things, how that so laboring you ought to support the weak, to remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he said it's more blessed to give than receive. So it provides this opportunity for many, many people, and many have responded. I'll read 1 John chapter 3, verse 18. Little children, let's not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and truth. Well, that's what he wants all of us to do. Not just say it, but in deed and in truth. Sincerely, in the right way. So, God's elect, along with many in the world, I guess we could say, help fight against the end-time trends, the love of many waxing cold. What does it say? And I'll read to you 2 Timothy 3:3, where the King James says, without natural affection, the International Standard Version, unfeeling. Unfeeling. Ever meet people like that, seems like? Don't care. Unfeeling. Brutal. Maybe more and more leaning or heading in that direction. Not everybody, for sure. Unfeeling, uncooperative, slanderous, degenerate, brutal, hateful of what's good, more and more despising of good things, wholesome things, right things, honesty, modesty, you name it. Maybe there's more scam artists today, I don't know. We'll see. All right. Two more points for us here, thoughts that I'm sharing with us today. I thought about this. I don't think I need to say it because I think somebody needs to hear this, but I do want to voice it. I do want to make mention of it. In Luke chapter 13, verse 4, let me spend just a couple of minutes on this thought. And we all know it. I'm not saying we're deficient in it. Luke 13, 4. It says, Jesus speaking about a calamity that took place, he says, now on these particular 18, in Luke 13:4, upon whom the tower of Siloam fell, and died, killed some of them. Do you think they were sinners above all men that dwell in Jerusalem? No. Some might have tried to figure that way, but he says, no, that isn't what happened. That just happened to be when the tower fell over, for whatever reason that it fell over. Well, several have stated, and I've stated it, as Mr. Frank said, I sent that in. The other pastor would feel like a sense of being blessed in the number of people that are in the city, and the number of people impacted by that. So we feel that way. I don't think there's anything wrong with mentioning that, but I have thought a time or two of the four that suffered a little more damage, and if I were one, I could probably feel pretty sad. And well, everybody's spared but me. You could feel a little bit like, kind of left out. So nobody's mentioned that I've talked to, that they feel that way at all. I think they understand what all of you understand. But Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11. I just wanted to say that so we're sensitive to that. We're all well-meaning about that, but some were not, didn't escape exactly in the same way of others. Maybe Ecclesiastes 9, verse 11 gives some insight on it. Of course, many of you, I've heard stories before I got here. Several of you flooded once, rebuilt and remodeled, and there we go again another time. I think that's when you said we decided to move, and I think maybe even the city took some steps to, alleviate some of the problems that were in that particular neighborhood. But a number of you have said how you had flooded. I don't know how many times. So it's nothing new. But Ecclesiastes 9:11, I returned and I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle always to the strong. It doesn't always seem to be the way life is. Neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill. Time and chance happens to them all. Circumstances come and go. Life is what it is. Things happen, and we all experience that as God's people. Bad things happen to good people. We know that. 1,000-year flood is going to flood somebody in this wide city, as scattered as we are. Going to flood somebody. So I think we should be a little aware of that when we talk about how wonderful or how blessed, and just think about that. And none of the others have said they felt anything like I'm saying, but I just wanted to take a minute to mention that. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 12. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 12. Beloved, think it not strange. Think it not strange concerning a fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened. It's not strange. Life sometimes is what it is, this physical world. So maybe just a word of reassurance so we don't have to dwell on that. Final point, number 4, again, one that I'm sure we're all aware of, is that material goods are just that. Material goods are just that. They're not spiritual. Now, we all work hard for what we have. We all try to take care of what we have. We've invested a lot of time, a lot of money. So it is disheartening when anything happens and we lose those things and their impact. And many individuals, just very heartrending. And driving here today, I don't know how many, several neighborhoods, the whole street, everything out on the, you've seen it, everything out on the front yard, carpeting and sofas and all of that, all the way lined down. It's just overwhelming sometimes to see that. And that's difficult. People have worked to have that, invested their time and their money. Hopefully it can be recovered by most everybody with the government and FEMA and what's available. So it is very sad. But Luke chapter 12 and verse 15, Luke 12:15. He said unto them, take heed, beware of covetousness. A man's life consists not in the abundance of things we possess. We have to always, of course, remember that in this life. It's a very, very blessed world, very rich nation. We have a lot. All of us do, no matter who we are. We always have to keep that important principle in mind. I think the 4 families primarily impacted really have set a fine example that way. Distraught for sure. How disheartening would that be to come home and see that or that happen? We know that. None of them have bemoaned the loss of their things. Not one of them had that kind of reaction. Sad to see that, and not easy. And your shoulders probably drop and sink, but they're just things. It's not what our life is about. God's blessings sometimes come before a trial, sometimes after. God's blessings sometimes come before a trial would come upon, and sometimes it's through it and afterward. Can be any number of those things. I appreciated James Whitley's comment to me. I was talking to him. He was going to help, looked like the Salyers and, evaluating what they needed and so on. He told me, he says, we'll help them get the place back better than before. Well, that's a great attitude and a great desire. And that's all good, and we'd like to see that. And hope that can be the case for everybody. And like I said before, so many of you been through it, and years later you look back on it, see that God saw you through it, and we came through, brethren responded, other people helped, and so it was a blessing in that respect. And I think James had that in mind, that, well, maybe when it's over, to turn back and say, well, look what we have after we're through it all. But it's still only physical and not spiritual. And that, of course, we know is the most important thing. Luke chapter 17, let's go there. Luke 17. course, a great deal in this particular important chapter, talking about the end time and days maybe not ahead. Maybe this is kind of a prelude at times of what is ahead and not too many more days. Who wants to contemplate that? But a lot of things happening and potential problems even now that the storm is gone. Luke chapter 17, verse 31. I think I'll back up a couple verses. Verse 26, just like in the days of Noah, it shall be also in the days of the Son of, when Christ returns. Well, what's similar to it? People's attitude, apparently. They ate and they drank, they went about their lives, in many ways a normal way, given and married till Noah entered into the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise also it'll be in the days of Lot. They ate and drank and bought, and they sold and planted and built, but the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. In that day, verse 31 and 32, he which shall be upon the housetop and his stuff in the house, let him not come down to take it away, and he that's in the field, let him likewise not return. Remember Lot's wife. So leave the stuff. There'll be a time when you leave it all. It's not important, the things. And that's always primary in our lives. The spiritual lessons, the spiritual values, our relationship with God is the most important. That's the pearl of great price. Not even a car or house or anything like that. We all understand that principle. It's not what we have, it's who we are. So who are we? Final verse, Philippians chapter 3 and verse 8. Philippians 3 and verse 8. Philippians chapter 3 and verse 8. What is more, I continue to consider all things to be a loss for what is more valuable. That's what we think when we're baptized. All the things of the world, they're not important to me. As important, put it that way, as the pearl of great price, the calling, the spirit that works in our lives. I continue to consider all these things to be lost for the sake of what is far more valuable, knowing the Messiah, Jesus, my Lord. It's because of him that I've experienced the loss of all those things. Indeed, I consider them rubbish in order to gain Christ, salvation, the kingdom of God. That's what we have our mind on. God's church and people move forward like the people in Hebrews chapter 11. The world was not worthy. We move forward. And so whatever is presented in our community or someone else, we'll all go forward as God's people with the Spirit of God and the love of God. We'll help one another or a family. And we move on forward towards the kingdom of God. That's what we've done. That's what we've always done. That's what we were called to do. And that's what I see us doing here as well today and in the days ahead. So let our light shine and God's Spirit guide our heart and our mind.